Somewhere in eastern China, buried under rice fields and lake sediment for thousands of years, there are the remains of a city. Not a village, not a settlement, a city with walls, with districts, with a water management system so sophisticated that engineers today still study it with genuine admiration. A city that existed before the Shang dynasty, before the Zhou, before any of the great dynasties that most people associate with ancient China. Before any of it, there were these people. And here is the thing that makes this genuinely strange. We don't know what they called themselves. We don't know what language they spoke. We don't know the name of a single person who lived there. No king, no priest, no farmer, nobody. They left behind no writing, no inscriptions, no records. Just the physical evidence of a civilization so organized, so hierarchical, so clearly intentional, that calling it anything less than a civilization feels like an understatement. And at the center of everything they left behind, jade, enormous quantities of it, carved with a precision that should not have been possible, shaped into objects that carried clear symbolic meaning, objects that appear in graves across a territory the size of a modern country. Whatever these people believed, whatever held their world together, jade was at the heart of it. Not gold, not bronze, jade. So who were they? Welcome to Legacy of Throne. Before we begin, drop your current city or country in the comments right now, along with your local time. Whether you are watching from Sydney or Tokyo, from Washington or Warsaw, from Toronto or London, tell us you are here. We read every single comment and love knowing where the Legacy of Throne community gathers. Subscribe if you haven't already, hit that notification bell, and let this extraordinary journey begins. How did they build what they built? And why did they vanish so completely that even their name didn't survive? That is the question we are going to spend the next stretch of time working through together. The site at the center of this story is called Liangzhu. That name comes from the modern Chinese village, near where archaeologists first started digging. It is not what the people who lived there called their home. We have no idea what they called it. Liangzhu is just our label, our way of pointing at something that otherwise has no handle. The culture flourished roughly between 3300 and 2300 BCE. That puts it more than 5,000 years ago. Contemporary with the early phases of ancient Egypt, roughly parallel to the Sumerian city-states of Mesopotamia, and happening entirely independently of both of them. This was not a backwater. This was not a late arrival to the story of human civilization. This was one of the places where complex society was being invented from scratch in real time, on its own terms. But here is where this story gets complicated, in a way that makes it genuinely worth paying attention to. Liangzhu left no text. Everything we think we know about them comes from archaeology, from what the ground preserves and what it destroys, from the shapes of objects and the patterns of how they were arranged, from soil layers and pollen samples and the chemical signatures of ancient floods. Archaeology is an incredibly powerful tool. It can tell you that a society was stratified, that some people had vastly more than others, that objects moved across long distances, that a city was planned rather than grown. But it cannot tell you what people called their gods, or whether they had a word for love, or what a mother whispered to her child. The evidence has hard edges and real limits, and being honest about those limits is part of what makes this story worth trusting. What the evidence can tell us is already astonishing. We are talking about a walled city with an inner core and outer districts surrounded by a hydraulic infrastructure, meaning a system of dams and channels and reservoirs that managed water across an area of almost 1,000 square kilometers. This was not accidental. This was not gradual. This required planning, coordination, labor mobilization on a scale that implies real political authority. Somebody was in charge. A lot of somebody-oddies were taking orders, and the whole system worked reliably for somewhere around 1,000 years. Then it stopped. The city was abandoned. The culture disappeared from the archaeological record with a suddenness that raises its own questions. The jade stopped being made. The water system stopped being maintained. The people, whatever remained of them, scattered or transformed into something archaeologists classify differently. A civilization that had lasted a millennium was gone in what feels by archaeological standards like an eye link. Why? That question has more than one answer depending on which researcher you ask, and we are going to get into all of it. Climate, floods, internal collapse, external pressure. All of these have been proposed, and none of them fully close the case. But before we get to the end, we need to understand what was actually there, because the scale of what Liangzhu built and organized and believed is the only way to make the disappearance feel as significant as it actually is. Before we go any further, quick thing, if you're listening to this on Spotify, thank you. Following the show there is free. It keeps the algorithm happy, and the link in the description also takes you to a version without ads and without background music, if that is your preference. It genuinely helps keep this going. And while I have your attention, drop a comment. Tell me where you are right now and what time it is. I read them, and it is always this strange, wonderful reminder that someone in Tokyo is listening at breakfast while someone in Toronto is listening at midnight. Berlin, Lagos, Oakland, Buenos Aires, all at once. That never stops being interesting to me. All right, so 5,000 years ago in the waterlogged lowlands south of what is now the Yangtze River Delta, a society was building something remarkable. They had no metal tools, they had no writing system, they had no wheel, and somehow they quarried, transported and carved jade into objects of extraordinary complexity, laid out a city on a floodplain with geometric precision, and moved enough earth to bury the evidence for millennia. Let's figure out how. Picture the landscape first. Before the cities, before the rice fields, before the thousands of years of human reshaping that have turned this region into one of the most densely populated places on Earth, the Lower Yangtze Basin was something close to a maze. A vast interlocking system of rivers, lakes, shallow marshes, and tidal flats spreading out across the coastal plain of what is now eastern China, south of Shanghai, in the modern province of Shang. The land did not have clean edges. It shifted seasonally between wet and wetter. The boundary between solid ground and open water was a negotiation, not a line. And that, counterintuitively, is exactly why people built something extraordinary here. Wetlands get dismissed. We associate them with difficulty, with insects, with terrain that resists the kind of neat organization humans prefer. But wetland environments, specifically the kind of productive mosaic you get at the junction of rivers and lakes and deltaic plains, are among the most resource-rich places a pre-industrial society could possibly inhabit. The water itself is a transportation network. No roads required. You move people, materials, and food by boat, which is faster, cheaper in labor terms, and capable of carrying far more weight than anything you can drag across land. The lakes and channels are full of fish, year-round protein that does not require the investment of hunting large game across open terrain. The shallow margins produce reeds in enormous quantities, which means building material, which means boats, baskets, roofing, tools. The higher ground between the water bodies, slightly elevated, slightly drier, is ideal for something specific that we will come back to in detail. Wet rice cultivation, which produces more calories per unit of land than almost any other agricultural system humans have ever devised. So the Lower Yangtze was not a difficult place to survive. It was, if you understood it, an extraordinarily generous one. The people who became Liangzhu culture understood it at a level that took centuries of accumulated knowledge to develop. But generous does not mean easy. The same hydrology that made this landscape productive also made it dangerous in ways that required an organized response rather than an individual one. The seasonal rains in this part of East Asia are not gentle. The monsoon system that drives precipitation across the region delivers water in concentrated bursts, and low-lying plains do not drain quickly. Floods were not occasional disasters here. They were a recurring structural feature of the environment. Predictable in the sense that they would happen. Unpredictable in the sense that you could not know exactly when, exactly how severe, or exactly where the water would decide to go this year rather than last year. Living here, without some mechanism for managing that water, was not really an option for a dense population. You either developed the infrastructure to control flooding, channel runoff, and store water for dry seasons, or you lived at the margins of what the landscape could support and hoped for luck. This is why geography shaped everything about Liangzhu. The transport routes followed the water. The settlements clustered on elevated ground between channels. The agricultural system was designed around flooding rather than despite it. And the political system, whatever it actually looked like at the human level, had to be capable of coordinating labor across a wide area because the water did not respect individual plots or individual communities. Managing it was inherently a collective problem. The scale of the hydraulic works we find at Liangzhu, which we will get into properly later, only makes sense against this background. These were not vanity projects. They were survival infrastructure, and the fact that they required massive coordinated effort tells you something real about how authority was organized. Now a word about what we mean when we say before China. This matters because it is easy to hear that phrase and misunderstand it in either of two directions. One mistake is to treat Liangzhu as somehow outside history, as a curiosity that predates the real story. The other mistake is to treat it as a straightforward ancestor of modern China, a kind of proto-dynasty that connects in a clean line to the Shang and the Zhou and everything after. Neither of those framings holds up. What before China actually means in this context is before the political unification, before the written dynastic histories, before the administrative and cultural apparatus that eventually consolidated different regional traditions under a single recognizable identity. The China of the Shang dynasty, with its oracle bones and its bronze ritual vessels and its recognizable writing system, does not appear until roughly 1600 BCE. Liangzhu was already gone by then. These people were not early Chinese, in the way that, say, early medieval Franks were early French. They were something else entirely, operating in a world that had not yet been organized into the categories we later imposed on it. And they were not alone in that world. The late Neolithic period across East Asia, roughly the span from about 4000 to 2000 BCE, was not a story of one culture developing in isolation while everyone else waited. It was a story of multiple regional cultures evolving in parallel, sometimes in contact with each other, sometimes genuinely independent. The Yangsha culture was developing in the Yellow River Basin to the north, producing distinctive painted pottery and millet-based agriculture. The Longshan culture emerged later also in the north, with its own technological trajectory. In the southeast, along with Liangzhu, you had the Majiabang and Hemudu cultures as earlier phases of wetland adaptation. These were not a ladder, each rung leading to the next. They were more like different experiments running simultaneously in different ecological theaters, each one solving the problem of how to build a complex society under its specific local conditions. Liangzhu was one of those experiments, but by most of the metrics we used to measure complexity, it was one of the most ambitious ones. The scale of the city, the reach of its trade networks, the sophistication of its water management, and the sheer volume and precision of its jade production put it in a category that demands serious attention. Not because it was Chinese before China existed, but because it was something that human beings built somewhere on this planet 5,000 years ago, and then the ground swallowed it so completely that we are only now beginning to understand what was actually there. Liangzhu did not arrive in textbooks as a finished idea. It crept into view one trench, one mound of soil at a time, and for a while, almost nobody realized what they were actually looking at. If you roll the story back to the early 20th century, the Lower Yangtze wetlands are still mostly being read as background, not as text. Farmers are pulling up odd things in their fields now and then, potsherds, polished stone tools, the occasional mysterious piece of carved green stone. Local collectors buy some of it. Some goes to curiosities cabinets in the cities, but without a framework, without a pattern. These are just old things. Interesting. Maybe not yet evidence of a vanished city-scale civilization. The turning point starts in the 1930s, when archaeologists begin paying systematic attention to Neolithic sites in the region. At a village called Liangzhu, on a low rise near the wetlands, surveys and small excavations turn up burials and artifacts that clearly aren't from any known historical dynasty. The pottery is thick and grey, not the painted wares familiar from Yangsha in the north. The stone tools are finely ground and polished, and there are these strange, heavy jade pieces by discs, Cong tubes that don't quite fit the patterns known from later Chinese ritual bronzes, but feel oddly like their ancestors. Still, with only a few graves and scattered material, early researchers classify Liangzhu as one more local Neolithic culture layer among many. Important, yes, but nobody is yet talking about large-scale hydraulic systems, urban planning, or an entire wetland civilization. The data doesn't justify it, not yet. This is where it helps to understand how archaeologists decide that a culture exists in the first place. It's not a label you apply just because you like a site. It's a pattern recognition problem. They look at pottery first, because pottery is everywhere, and it breaks in ways that preserve evidence. The clay recipes, firing techniques, surface treatments, and shapes form a kind of fingerprint. If you see the same kinds of jars, bowls, and tripods made in the same way, showing up over and over across different sites, you're probably looking at people who learned from each other, or bought from each other. Then they look at burial patterns. Are the dead flexed on their sides, or laid out straight? Are there grave goods? Do some graves have far more and finer objects than others? Consistent habits around death are a strong marker of shared beliefs. Tools matter as well. The exact shapes of axes, adzes, knives, the way blades are hafted, the use of jade versus common stone, all of that speaks to a shared technological tradition. Finally, they map out settlement layouts. Where are the houses placed relative to each other? Are there defensive ditches or walls? Are there platforms, central spaces, zones that might have been reserved for elites or rituals? When pottery, burials, tools, and settlement forms all cluster together in a consistent package across multiple locations, archaeologists start using a cultural name as shorthand. Liangzhu becomes not just a village, but a cultural horizon. The big shift for Liangzhu comes in the second half of the 20th century and accelerates in the just last few decades. More systematic surveys and rescue excavations, prompted by construction projects, dams, roads and urban expansion, start turning up site after site across the Lower Yangtze. The same grey-black pottery, the same style of polished stone and jade tools, the same Bai and Cong forms in burials, and increasingly the same kind of settlement positioning, slightly raised ground near ancient river channels and marsh edges. What looked like a local phenomenon begins to resolve into an entire network. Dozens, then hundreds of sites share that lean signature. Some are small hamlets, some are cemeteries. A few, as excavation scales up, reveal something else. Planned layouts, encircling earthworks, and around what we now call the Liangzhu core area, evidence of enormous hydraulic constructions. That's when interpretations start changing. This is not just a Neolithic culture in the narrow sense. This is a complex system that by many definitions crosses the line into early civilization. But to say any of that with a straight face, you have to know when it happened. Dating is where archaeology shifts from pattern spotting to chronology building, and it is rarely as simple as people in documentaries make it sound. The first layer of dating is relative. You build a stratigraphy. What lies above what? If a burial cuts through a house floor, the burial is younger. If flood sediments bury a settlement, the flood is later than the occupation. You compare these sequences across sites. Certain pottery styles appear below others consistently, so you know which is earlier. Over time, you can assemble a relative timeline of phases. This type of Liangzhu pottery belongs to an earlier stage, that Jade style, to a later one. Then you push for absolute dates. Organic remains, charcoal from hearths, burned rice grains from storage pits, wooden stakes from dikes, can be subjected to radiocarbon dating. The radioactive decay of carbon-14 gives you a date range in years before present, which you calibrate against known fluctuations in atmospheric carbon. No single radiocarbon date is perfect. Each one comes with error bars. So archaeologists collect many from multiple layers and multiple sites, and look for coherent clusters. This is where Liangzhu's story sharpens. Radioarbon dates from settlement layers, from rice paddies, from the great earthen dams, and the channels all converge on a window roughly between 3300 and 2300 BCE. Cross-checks with other regional sequences, early and late Himud, Maja Bang, and then later, cultures like Kijia or Lan further north, help anchor Liangzhu within the broader Neolithic puzzle of East Asia. The timelines line up in a way that suggests Liangzhu is late Neolithic, flourishing roughly 1,000 years before the earliest accepted Shang state in the north. But there's a missing piece that shapes how confidently anyone can claim to know what was actually going on. Writing, or rather, the lack of it. In later Chinese history, you can quote inscriptions, you can read oracle bones that say who made the sacrifice, what question they ask. You can identify kings by name, administrative offices, legal proclamations. At Liangzhu, nothing like that has shown up. No undisputed writing system, no royal names, no records of battles, taxes, edicts or myths. That absence forces a different kind of caution. We can call the central site a city based on its scale, planning and functions, but we cannot read what its inhabitants called it. We infer hierarchy from burial wealth and architecture, but we cannot know whether authority rested in a hereditary king, a council of lineages, a network of ritual specialists, or some mixture. We see vast waterworks, and can reasonably speak of organized labor, but we do not have administrative tablets that spell out quotas. This gap created a lot of room for early misinterpretations. At first, some scholars saw Liangzhu Jade simply as luxury objects from later historically attested dynasties that had somehow migrated down into the ground by chance. Others slotted Liangzhu into a tidy theology, a straightforward ancestor of Shang civilization, as if there was a direct unbroken line from these wetland jade carvers to the bronze casters on the Yellow River. When you want a clean story of Chinese civilization, it is tempting to assign Liangzhu the role of proto-everything. As more sites appeared, and the dating tightened, those simple stories started to crack. The geographic center of Liangzhu is not the Yellow River, but the Lower Yangtze wetlands. Its economy is built around rice, not millet. Its monumental investments are water control earthworks, not walled palace temple complexes in a dry valley. Its jade repertoire is distinct, and while later dynasties clearly revered and reused some of these forms, the relationship looks more like cultural borrowing across time than a single, unbroken lineage. Interpretations evolved instead of the origin of China. Liangzhu began to be seen as one of several high-complexity regional civilizations in late Neolithic East Asia, interacting in ways we are still piecing together. Its jade might have traveled far beyond the wetlands, its ideas even farther. But the story we can tell about it remains bounded by what the ground has chosen to preserve. Potsherds, post holes, rice husks, tombs, tools, and earthworks, but no written voice. So the discovery of Liangzhu is not a moment, it is a slow accumulation of clues, the same pottery turning up again and again, the same burial patterns repeating across the landscape, the same radiocarbon ranges clustering, until suddenly a picture snaps into focus. There was a city here, and more than a city. A whole system coherent enough to leave a fingerprint from one side of the delta to the other. And once you accept that, the next question almost asks itself, what did that system look like on the ground? How do you plan a city in a landscape made of water? Start with the obvious problem. If your landscape is mud, channels, and seasonal floods, how do you even have a city? At Liangzhu, the answer seems to be, you build one. When archaeologists talk about the Liangzhu core, they aren't pointing to a vague cluster of huts. They're talking about a deliberately bounded, carefully arranged space that sprawled over several square kilometers, set on slightly higher ground, wrapped in massive earthen walls. Not just one wall either. Layers of enclosure, an inner platformed area with especially dense architecture, outer residential zones, and then beyond that, the broader mosaic of fields, patties, and satellite hamlets. The main wall alone is staggering. Tens of meters wide at the base, several kilometers in circumference, composed of piled earth packed in layers. It wasn't a random pile of dirt thrown up in a panic. Sections show consistent construction techniques, suggesting teams working from shared templates. Inside that perimeter, the ground itself was reshaped, leveled here, raised there into platforms that lifted key buildings above the damp. What emerges from the excavation plans is not chaos, but zoning. On some platforms, you see dense clusters of post holes, the footprints of large timber, buildings that likely served administrative or ritual functions. Nearby, but distinct, are residential areas with smaller, more repeated house forms, rectangular ground plans oriented in similar directions, organized along what looks suspiciously like lanes. In other zones, the density of hearths, slag, debris, and specialized tools spikes, hinting at craft workshops. In others, still pits and jars cluster together, the signature of storage. It's not a grid like later imperial cities, but it's also not just houses dropped wherever there was a dry patch. Certain activities are concentrated and separated from others. There is an inside and an outside. There are thresholds. This is where the argument for planning starts to get teeth. You can have a big village grow up organically. You can even have a defensive ditch that everyone deepens a little more each year. But Liangzhu's central site looks different. The scale is beyond what a few households, or even a single lineage could manage in their spare time. Think through the logistics. To throw up monumental walls and platforms in a wetland environment, you need to survey alignments, coordinate the movement of enormous volumes of earth, ensure that foundations won't just slump back into the muck. You need to synchronize labor so that embankments connect, channels meet, and platforms reach the same elevation. The repeated house forms and standardized orientations suggest someone decided at some point that this was where the residential quarter would go, and this was how houses should sit within it. Archaeologists see that fingerprint in the regularity, doorways facing similar directions, structures built on parallel axis, storage pits cut in specific zones, rather than randomly in every yard. It looks less like each household improvising, and more like a shared plan unfolding. And then there's the broader engineered landscape, which ties all of this together. Canals, ditches, and ponds lace through and around the city zone. Some functioned clearly as drainage, keeping residential platforms dry. Others look navigable, at least by small boats. You can imagine daily movement, not only along packed earth paths, but by water. People pulled from outlying hamlets into the central area, cutting across fields and marshes, docking at the edges of the walled zone. Within the city, that watery infrastructure doubles as a circulation system. Goods, people, perhaps even ritual processions moving along prescribed routes in and out of gates, in and out of districts. When you superimpose the canals, the walls, the platforms, and the house clusters, it stops looking like an accidental sprawl and starts looking like a designed organism. This is urbanism without stone, without writing, and without the kinds of palace ruins that grab headlines. Its monumentality is horizontal, sunk into earthworks and soil chemistry, rather than standing up in photogenic ruins. The absence of inscriptions here cuts both ways. On one hand, we can't point to a tablet that says, "In the reign of such and such lord, we ordered the construction of the eastern wall using 10,000 workers." On the other, the construction itself is the inscription. The earth is the record. Coordinated labor over years or decades implies some entity with the authority to mobilize people and resources. You need mechanisms to feed workers, to schedule tasks around agricultural cycles, to allocate land plots inside the walls. That can be a king, a council of elders, temple managers, powerful clans, Archaeology can't yet say, but the existence of that kind of coordination is very hard to deny once you look at the scale and coherence of Liangzhu's core. Daily life inside this planned wetland city would have been shaped by these choices in ways that don't always show up in dramatic artifacts, but do in patterns. Families lived in houses raised on platforms or stilts, negotiated narrow lanes that turned muddy in the rains but drained into nearby ditches, heard the constant presence of water at the edges of their neighborhoods. Children grew up threading paths between craft areas where jade was being ground, pottery was being fired, tools were being polished. Workers walked routine routes from their homes to the fields, from the fields to storage areas, from storage to distribution points closer to the inner zone. Food surplus likely moved along fixed channels too, literally. Rice from the paddies came in by boat or by shoulder load, passed into storage pits or granaries near the city, then redistributed. That flow of grain, tools and prestige goods across a space that had distinct production, storage, and elite zones is exactly the sort of pattern that in other regions defines an urban center. But were the people of Liangzhu living in a city in the way we use that word? This is where scholars part ways. If by city you mean a dense settlement with tens of thousands of people, clear administrative hierarchies, full-time craft specialists, and formal public spaces, the Liangzhu core seems to check quite a few boxes. Population estimates are always shaky, but the sheer scale of the enclosed area suggests at least several thousand inhabitants in and around the main center, plus a surrounding halo of smaller communities plugged into its orbit. If by city you require written bureaucracy, standardized coinage and monumental stone architecture, Liangzhu falls short. It's late Neolithic, not Bronze Age. Its tools are stone and jade, its monuments are earth and water. Its records, if they existed at all, were probably perishable. Some researchers therefore prefer softer terms: large, central settlement, regional center, proto-urban complex. Others argue that hanging on to those labels just smuggles in a bias toward later, drier bronze and brick civilizations. By Neolithic standards, especially in a wetland, the Liangzhu core looks like a city, a planned hierarchical hub that reordered both landscape and society. What most agree on is that whatever label you choose, this wasn't just a big village that happened to sit by a river. The walls, platforms, canals, and patterned neighborhoods say something new had crystallized in the Lower Yangtze, an experiment in building dense, organized life on unstable ground. And at the heart of that experiment lay a deeper gamble that people could not only live with water, but command it. To see how far they pushed that idea, you have to step outside the city walls into the giant ring of dams and dikes that wrapped the whole system. Step outside those walls, and the scale of Liangzhu's ambition suddenly jumps. The earthworks don't stop at the city edge. They expand into an outer ring of dams, levees, and reservoirs that, taken together, look less like a village's flood defenses and more like a regional hydraulic system. Northwest of the core, archaeologists have mapped a series of massive embankments now known as the Tangshan and Moyoshan systems. On the ground, they're long, low ridges. On survey maps, they resolve into sweeping arcs and straight segments that link hills, cut across low-lying valleys, and, crucially, stand at elevations that would have allowed them to hold back water. Some of these dams are hundreds of meters long, up to several meters high, with bases wide enough to have taken thousands of cubic meters of earth. Their alignments aren't random. They track topographic contours, close natural gaps between higher ground, and create enclosed basins where rainwater and river overflow could be captured. In between these major embankments, smaller dikes and levees lace the landscape. Here, a low ridge splits a valley, diverting flow to one side. There, a raised causeway doubles as both road and water barrier. The picture that emerges is of a wetland that has been compartmentalized, turned into a chain of managed pools, channels, and storage areas. This is where the phrase "water control equals power" stops being metaphorical. In a monsoon-fed land, the difference between prosperity and catastrophe is timing and volume. Too much water at the wrong moment, and your patties wash out. Too little, and seedlings fail. If you can flatten that curve, shave the peak off floods, hold back water to release later, you can stabilize harvests. The Liangzhu system appears built to do exactly that. High outer dams catch the first surge of floodwater and slow it. Behind them, broad reservoirs store excess. Controlled outlets, now eroded, but inferred from gaps and channels, would have let water be, bled out gradually into lower-lying paddies and canals around the central settlement. Think through what that means for power. If you live downstream of that dam, your livelihood now depends on decisions made upriver: when to open a gate, when to reinforce a weak spot whose fields get priority water in a dry year. Control the water, and you don't just protect fields, you become the arbiter of risk. To build such a system in the first place, someone has to do more than panic dig when the river rises. You need surveyors who can read subtle gradients across a landscape that, to the untrained eye, is just flat. You need people who can walk kilometer with simple tools, mark out lines that will actually hold water where you want it, and tie those lines into existing streams. The embankments at Liangzhu show that kind of foresight. Their tops tend to sit within narrow elevation bands. In places, separate dikes built from different directions meet at clean joins, meaning teams were working to a shared plan, not improvising as they went. That's surveying. Then there is maintenance. Earth doesn't stay put in a floodplain out of respect for your engineering. It slumps, erodes, cracks. Rodents burrow, plants root. Water looks for weak spots. An embankment that isn't constantly inspected and patched will fail. Maybe not this year, but soon. So, picture the social machinery implied by those long, silent ridges. Seasonal work parties trudging along the tops of dikes, tamping fresh earth into depressions, pulling out saplings before their roots destabilize the slope. Teams dredging feeder canals, choked with silt after the rains. Supervisors, whether we call them chiefs, foremen, or ritual officials, allocating whose labor goes where, whose village is responsible for which stretch. This is infrastructure that only makes sense if it persists across generations. If your dam takes 10 years to complete, and your children will be the ones benefiting from its protection, you are by definition planning in centuries, not seasons. The payoff, if it worked, was enormous. More predictable water means more reliable rice. More reliable rice means you can support more people per square kilometer. Once your harvests are less whiplashed by flood and drought, you can dare to specialize. In a small, unstable farming community, almost everyone has to hedge, farm, fish, make their own tools, patch their own clothes, because one bad year could wipe out surplus and leave no room for passengers. In a landscape where waterworks smooth out the worst shocks, you can afford full-time jade carvers, potters, woodworkers, people who spend most of their days doing something other than coaxing grain out of the mud. Liangzhu's artifact record lines up with that expectation. High volumes of finely worked jade, standardized tools, elaborate ritual items. All of that implies artisans who had regular access to food without producing it themselves. The waterworks weren't just protecting fields. They were underwriting craft ceremony and the social complexity that goes with them. But what exactly were those dams and reservoirs for? Here is where interpretations diverge. One camp emphasizes flood control. They point to the placement of major embankments near river inlets and vulnerable lowlands, the sheer scale of some dams, and argue that their primary purpose was to shield the core, settlement, and surrounding patties from catastrophic inundation. In this view, reservoirs are essentially safety valves, places to park excess water when rivers run too high. Another camp leans toward irrigation. They note that some dikes seem to sit not at the floodfront, but along lines that would help spread water evenly over a wide area, paired with canals leading into cultivated zones. These structures could have stored monsoon water and then distributed it during dry spells, keeping patties wet when skies turn stingy. Then there's transportation. Many of the channels tied into this system are straight, relatively uniform in width, and link different parts of the basin in ways that make more sense for moving goods than for purely hydraulic efficiency. Archaeologists have suggested that some reservoirs doubled as harbor basins, where boats could load and unload grain, timber, or jade. A gentle, controlled water level is excellent, not only for rice, but for predictable navigation. In practice, these functions aren't mutually exclusive. An embankment that keeps floodwater out of your houses can also serve as a raised roadway between settlements. A reservoir that moderates peak flows can also be tapped during drought and used as a boat landing. A canal that diverts water toward paddies can also carry cargo between workshops and storage pits. The more researchers map, the more Liangzhu's system looks like an integrated multi-purpose water landscape rather than a single-function project. It's less a dam here, a canal there, and more a designed hydrological envelope around the city. What all sides tend to agree on is that this envelope changed the rules of life in the Lower Yangtze. Instead of surrendering to a wetland's moods, Liangzhu communities tried to regiment them. They wrapped their fields and homes in engineered contours, turned flood pulses into stored capital, and built social hierarchies around the ability to command large groups for construction and upkeep. Water became not just a background condition, but the medium through which authority, labor, and surplus were organized. And once you have that much control over when and where water flows, another possibility opens up: tuning the landscape specifically for rice. To see how that played out, you have to go from the dams and dikes down into the paddies themselves, where mud, grain, and management fused into the engine that fed this Jade city. Stand in that mud with them for a minute, because rice, especially wet rice, is not just plant seed, wait, harvest. It's a choreography between plant, water, soil, and human attention. And in a place like the Lower Yangtze, it's the difference between a scattered wetland hamlet and a city that can afford to stack jade in tombs. The basic logic of wet rice agriculture is deceptively simple. You take a low-lying field and surround it with small earthen bunds, miniature dikes that hold water in. You level the surface so there are no dry patches or deep puddles. You flood it shallowly, not so deep that the plants drown, but enough to blanket the soil. Rice, unlike most other grains, is happy there. Its stems can grow through standing water. Many of its weeds and pests cannot. The water layer moderates temperature swings, slows down some diseases, and crucially, lets you pack a lot of plants into a small area. Compared to dryland cereals, a well-run paddy system can pump out more calories per hectare year after year. That's why, when you look at some of the densest pre-modern populations on Earth, you keep finding rice at the base of the pyramid. Liangzhu sits right in one of the places where that story was being written. Long before monumental dams, people in this region were experimenting with rice along natural floodplains and backswamps. By the time Liangzhu culture emerges, the botanical remains shift from occasional, probably wild, towards systematic, managed, and increasingly domesticated. Grains are more uniform. Hulls show traits associated with human selection, and the context they appear in pits, burned concentrations. Fields with patterned microtopography line up with deliberate cultivation. Now pair that with the water control you just saw. Those big outer dams and levees create the frame. Inside it, the landscape can be subdivided into paddies, stepped down in elevation, each one receiving water from the one above it and passing it to the one below. With sloughs, gaps in bunds, and small channels, farmers can fine-tune depth and timing. Monsoon early and hard this year. You spread the surge out through the system, letting upper paddies take the hit, then passing water downstream as needed. Rains sputter and stop. You open gates from reservoirs, pushing water into the lower fields to keep young rice from drying out. Archaeologists trying to reconstruct this don't get aerial drone footage. They get soil, thin layers of silty clay with iron mottling and root traces that match, waterlogged conditions, pollen spectra that shows spikes in rice relative to wild wetland plants, patterns of small ridges and depressions, still faintly visible under later deposits. Taken together, they sketch a picture of a wetland turned into a kind of terrace sponge holding, moving, and draining water in ways that serve one crop above all. And rice wasn't alone in this system. If you're living in a marshscape, you're not going to ignore the fish, snails, and crustaceans that practically throw themselves at you in flood season. Liangzhu sites are rich in aquatic remains, fish bones, turtle shells, freshwater shellfish. Some of those shells were drilled and turned into ornaments, but many show signs of having been processed for food. The edges of patties and canals double as foraging zones. Flooded fields attract carp and other fish that come in to feed or spawn. Farmers can trap them in small nets or enclosures when water levels change. The same canals that irrigate rice also function as fish runs. In some later rice economies, people essentially farm rice and fish together in the same plots. It's not proven that Liangzhu did this systematically, but the ecological logic is there. Around the slightly higher ground, levee tops, natural mounds, the raised city core, there's evidence for fruits and nuts, acorns, water chestnuts, possibly peach. These could be gathered wild or encouraged through low-intensity management. On drier patches, people hunted deer, wild boar, and smaller mammals. Bone assemblages show cut marks and burning, the signatures of butchery and cooking. As for animals under human control, the picture is more complicated. Pig bones show up in abundance at many sites, tied to Liangzhu culture, often in domestic contexts. Their age profiles and morphology suggest at least some level of domestication, or at minimum, very intensive management of wild populations. Dogs are present too, almost obligatorily, in Neolithic East Asia, serving as hunting aids, camp guards, and occasionally food. Together, this creates a diversified food web wrapped around a rice core. Rice patties pump out starch. Fish, turtles, and shellfish add protein and fats, especially in the hungry gap between planting and harvest. Pigs turn kitchen scraps and byproducts into meat. Nuts and gathered plants buffer bad years. The whole system is tuned to the seasonal heartbeat of the monsoon, but spread out enough that a failure in one part doesn't automatically spell famine. That diversity is exactly what you need if you want to do something radical in prehistoric terms. Free a chunk of your population from food production. Because surplus is not just, we had a good year. For surplus to transform a society, it has to be dependable enough that people can count on it, build plans on it, stake their lives on it. The waterworks gave Liangzhu a fighting chance at that. If you can smooth out the worst spikes of flood and drought, you can start to think in multi-year cycles. Granaries likely built in wood that has since rotted away, but inferred from storage pits and post patterns let you carry grain across seasons. Pottery vessels big enough to hold serious quantities of rice turn up in domestic and ritual contexts. Charred clumps of grain in some pits may be the remnants of stored food destroyed by fire or ritual burning. With stable calories flowing in, you can have people whose job is not to weed patties, but to chip jade, cast and polish stone tools, weave textiles, coordinate labor, or perform rituals. Those jade discs and tubes don't appear out of thin air. They are the product of thousands of hours of grinding, drilling, and polishing by specialists who need to eat every single day while producing objects that from a strictly survivalist perspective do nothing. The same goes for builders who lay out raised platforms, embankments, and timber structures, and for the organizers who plan dams years in advance. All of them are riding on the back of the rice-fish-pig complex and the water regime that sustains it. But there's a catch. The very thing that makes wetlands so generous, their sensitivity to water, also makes them treacherous. Rice is robust in some ways and fragile in others. It loves consistent shallow flooding, hates prolonged deep submergence at the wrong growth stage, and suffers if patties dry out just as seedlings are establishing. One late-season cyclone that dumps too much water can rot grain in the air. A levee breach upstream at the wrong moment can scour an entire field, leaving behind bare, nutrient-poor subsoil. A year when monsoon rains simply don't come on schedule forces hard choices which plots get the last trickle from the reservoir and which are written off. Liangzhu's elaborate hydraulic shell was an attempt to shift those dice, but it couldn't remove risk. It just concentrated management. If your food comes mainly from a wild landscape, a bad flood might move the fish around and drown some plants. But the ecosystem as a whole absorbs the shock. When your calories are locked into grids of patties, a failure in the water system can be all or nothing. The trade-off for high yields and dense populations is vulnerability to infrastructure, breakdown, to miscalculation, to climate swings just a little outside the historic norm. There are social trade-offs too. When some fields sit higher on the water ladder than others, literally upstream, they have structural advantages. They get first access to water released from reservoirs, and they're slightly safer from deep floods if levees hold. Those are the fields you want to control. If you're an emerging elite, access to water and to the surplus it creates becomes a lever for hierarchy. Households who can count on irrigation in a dry year are better able to invest in long-term projects. Nicer houses, better tools, offerings for ancestors, patronage of artisans. Households at the margins, low-lying, last in line, dependent on trickle-down flows, live closer to the edge, even in good years. And when the whole system is this finely tuned, storms and floods are not just weather events, they are tests of the social order. If embankments fail, people will ask, who was in charge of maintenance? Why weren't they repaired? Why did that village get rescue labor, and mine didn't? If, during a dry spell, certain patties stay green because they had priority access to reservoir outlets, everyone can see who has pull and who doesn't. Living in a rich but fragile environment means living with that constant tension. On good years, the patties shimmer, granaries fill. Fish run thick in the canals and the city's workshops hum. The same water that once threatened to drown everything has been disciplined into feeding tens of thousands. On bad years, when storms arrive off rhythm or rivers run too low, the brilliance of the system reveals its underside. The more you rely on engineered abundance, the harsher the crash when the engineering is outpaced by the climate. For a while, though, Liangzhu seemed to keep the balance. They turned swamp into surplus, and surplus into jade, ritual, and rank. To see how deeply that surplus reshaped their world, you have to look at what they did with their most mysterious product, those pieces of polished green stone that in Liangzhu hands became more than jewelry. They became a kind of technology in their own right. Jade is a nightmare material. If you're used to thinking of stone tools as hit rock with other rock until sharp, jade laughs at you. Most of the Liangzhu pieces that we call jade are actually nephrite, a tough fibrous silicate that ranks high on hardness scales and even higher on the will this waste my time index. You don't flake nephrite the way you do flint. Try to hit it, and it tends to bruise, not break cleanly. Its internal structure is more like a mass of tangled fibers than a brittle glass. That's exactly why later cultures loved it for axes and blades. It doesn't shatter easily, it resists wear, and it's harder than most of the things you'd ever want to cut. Those same properties make it brutal to shape. To turn a raw jade cobble into a smooth, perfectly symmetrical disc, or a square tube with a round hole, you can't rely on impact. You have to erode it away, grain by grain. Imagine a jade worker's day. You start with a roughly shaped blank. Maybe someone upstream in the production chain has already knocked off the most awkward corners with harder stone hammers, but the real work is still ahead. You sit or squat, brace the piece, and start rubbing it against a harder surface with abrasive grit, sand rich in quartz, crushed harder stones, maybe even specially selected powders. Hours go by, then days. For the largest lean objects, probably weeks to drill a hole you don't punch through with a metal bit. You twist a hollow tube made of bone, wood, or softer stone, feeding an abrasive slurry at the contact point. The tube itself doesn't cut much. The suspended grit does. It's like using liquid sandpaper powered by your wrists. As the slurry grinds, a cylindrical core slowly emerges from the other side. You clear it, Freshen the abrasive. Keep turning over and over. Polishing is its own ordeal. You step down to finer and finer abrasives, working every surface until it reflects light smoothly. The high-gloss sheen on many lean pieces is not accidental. It's the accumulated product of thousands of repetitive strokes performed by people who knew exactly how much pressure, how much grit, and how much patience each stage demanded. None of this can happen in a vacuum. Jade workshops aren't just a person and a rock. They require infrastructure. You need steady access to abrasives. That means organized collection of sand and stone powders, sorting by grain size, maybe even controlling for mineral composition. You need water to make slurry, to cool surfaces, to wash away residue. In a city like Liangzhu, that likely means working close to canals or wells, or at least having someone hauling buckets. You need tools, drill tubes, cords if you're using a bow drill, grinding slabs, supports, containers for different grades of abrasive. You need space, dry, stable, out of the worst of the rain and dust, where pieces can sit for long periods without being lost or damaged. And critically, you need time. A farmer missing a day of weeding can see the results in a field quickly. A jade worker missing a day just delays a necklace or a ritual tube or an axe that will never touch a tree. So, if someone is free to sit for hours grinding stone, that means the rice fields are producing enough regularly enough that the community can support them. When archaeologists excavate Liangzhu sites, they sometimes find concentrations of jade chips, partly finished pieces, broken drills, and piles of abrasive stone debris. These are the scars of production. They tell us that jade was not just something made casually at home during slack season, it was an industry, and industry means networks. Nephrite doesn't pop out of the patty bank mud. The best-known sources in eastern China are in mountain belts hundreds of kilometers away from Liangzhu's land core. Petrographic and geochemical analyses suggest that at least some of the jade used at Liangzhu came from specific upland zones to the southwest and west. That implies several things at once. First, someone had to know where those stones were. That knowledge doesn't appear magically. It's built over generations of foraging, prospecting, and testing. Second, the raw boulders, or preformed blanks, had to travel down river valleys, along overland paths, maybe in dugout canoes or carried in baskets. The farther you go, the more hands are involved. Local extractors, middlemen, transporters, the people feeding and hosting them, and route. By the time a jade cobble reaches a workshop in Liangzhu, it may have passed through many communities. That flow of stone is also a flow of information and obligation. Who owes jade to whom? Whose prestige depends on controlling access to distant quarries? Which families or lineages have the right to sponsor particular artisans? Finished objects travel to Lianghu-style jades, especially characteristic forms like flat discs and squared tubes, turn up far beyond the city itself, at sites scattered across the Lower Yangtze region and beyond. Some are high quality, clearly made by skilled specialists. Others look like local imitations, copying the style with less skill or inferior stone. Every one of those pieces is a data point, proof that Liangzhu, jade aesthetic, and perhaps its ritual ideas, were radiating outward along exchange routes. The stone itself can sometimes be traced back. When it matches sources near the core, it suggests finished goods were moving as diplomatic gifts, trade items, or status symbols. When the stone is local but the shape is Lingo style, it suggests ideas were moving even when rocks were not. Jade in that sense is a map of connections you can hold in your hand. It's also a window into specialization. You don't wake up one day and intuit how to drill a perfect concentric hole through a seam-thick ring without cracking it. You learn from someone, and they probably learned from someone before them. On some Liangzhu pieces, you can see sequences of work, the way a surface was first rough ground, then tread up along certain angles, then polished. The way drill holes align or fail to align. These are like fingerprints of workshop traditions. Different clusters of objects seem to have slightly different habits. The angle of certain bevels, the finishing of edges, hinting at individual schools or lineages of jade workers. Teaching those skills takes time. A novice might start on waste pieces or simple beads, learning how much pressure is too much, how to read the sound and feel of stone, and drill or grind. Over years, they graduate to more complex forms. At the top, a small number of master specialists are trusted with the largest, most symbolically loaded items. Massive discs, densely carved mask motifs, complex tubes with precise proportions. For such a system to persist, you need continuity. That means stable enough food supplies, political backing, and cultural value that children can afford to spend youth apprenticed to stone rather than hoe. It also means that jade production is not just an economic activity, but a social institution, embedded in families, lineages, maybe even tied to particular ritual obligations. Within this jade universe, not all objects serve the same roles. Some are unapologetically functional. Jade or jade-like stone axes and adzes have polished blades and wear patterns that suggest real use. Cutting, chopping, working wood. Nephrite's toughness makes it genuinely good for this. These tools might double as status markers. I can afford a jade axe, but they still cut trees. Others barely pretend to be useful. Oversized axes too big and thin to risk on a log. Discs with no cutting edges at all, just central holes and immaculate surfaces. Tubes that would make terrible containers, but perfect offerings. Many of these show little or no wear from everyday handling. Instead, they cluster in tombs, caches, or ritual pits. Their function is meaning. They operate as symbols of rank, of connection to ancestors or spirits, of participation in a shared cosmology. Owning them, displaying them, burying them with the dead, are all ways of broadcasting position, in a social order that is increasingly stratified. In that sense, jade at Liangzhu is not just treasure, it's a technology of power and memory. It encodes labor in its surfaces. Every polished stroke a calorie burned by someone whose rice came from somewhere else. It encodes networks in its material. Each piece a chunk of mountain carried across long distances, and it encodes learning in its forms. Generations of trial and error, refined into standard designs that mean something to the people who see them. When you line up those discs and tubes, you're not just looking at pretty stones. You're looking at a system that turns surplus grain, river routes, mountain quarries, and human hands into solidified hierarchy. And the shapes themselves, the circles, the squares, the carved faces, hint that this wasn't random decoration. They were carving a world view into the hardest material they could reliably work. To see that world view, we have to look closely at two of their favorite forms. Let's start with the simplest looking one. A bai is just a flat disc of jade with a hole in the center. At least that's what it looks like if you strip all the meaning off and describe it like a hardware part. But lean are not washers. They are large, carefully standardized circles, sometimes as broad as a person's torso, often polished to a soft, almost liquid shine. Their edges are usually even the central holes, and not random. They tend to hit similar proportions from piece to piece. Some are razor-thin, improbably delicate for stone. Others are thicker, a kind of jade donut you'd hesitate to even pick up without two hands. Cong are the other signature shape. Imagine taking a cylinder, drilling it through end to end, then squaring the outside. So what you get is a tube that is round inside and square outside. Stack several together, and you have a column of alternating circles and squares. Liangzhu Cong range from less than the length of your finger to objects almost as tall as a child, with walls so thin that you can see light blush through polished edges. Both forms existed elsewhere in Neolithic China, but at leastly made, and crucially, they're not random personal ornaments. At Liangzhu Tiri's Bai and Cong cluster in high-status burials. The richest graves may have dozens sometimes arranged around the body under the head stacked in careful groups. Poorer graves, if they have jade at all, might have a single small piece, or none. So what are these things later? Chinese texts written 2,000 years after Liangzhu vanished spin a very tidy story. Discs, they say, belong to the heavens. Tubes belong to the earth. Circles are celestial. Squares are terrestrial. Bai are for offerings to the sky. Cong for offerings to the soil and the spirits below. It's tempting to read this straight back into Liangzhu and say, ah, there it is, the earliest heaven and earth cosmology carved in stone. Many scholars do see a continuity. Others warn that this neat mapping might be a retroactive myth the later Zhou and Han elites projected onto older shapes they themselves were trying to inherit. Archaeology doesn't give us instruction manuals. It gives us patterns, and the patterns are striking. Cong, with their square exteriors and round cores, are often elaborately decorated. On the corners on banded faces, you see recurring motifs. Paired eyes, a kind of fanged mouth, curling brows or horns, sometimes stacked in tiers. The lines are geometric, almost abstract. But if you look at enough of them in sequence, a visual grammar emerges. Many researchers interpret these as stylized masks, part human, part animal, part something else. Some compare them to later Tawatati monster masks on Shang bronzes, centrally placed eyes flanked by horns, jaws implied rather than fully shown. Others think they might represent specific spirit beings, clan emblems, or mythic ancestors. Animals sneak in too. You get bird-like profiles with hooked beaks and crests. You get coiled forms that might be snakes or dragons or just inventive scrolls. Sometimes the animal is almost lost inside abstraction, just a repeating scurve that suggests movement, scales, or wind. On by decoration is usually more restrained. Many are plain surfaces left uncarved, as if the pure circle and gloss were enough. When they are carved, you see bands of tiny motifs, fine lines, dots, sometimes simplified versions of the same mask-like patterns seen on Cong, but less crowded, more about framing the hole in the outer rim. Taken together, these shapes and motifs look less like random aesthetic choices and more like a shared visual language. Think about the repetition across multiple Liangzhu sites, across decades of occupation. You keep seeing the same basic recipe. Square outside, round inside, corner faces, tiered bands, the same kinds of eyes, similar ratios between the width of the Cong and the diameter of the inner tube. BI, with consistent thicknesses and hole sizes for particular size classes. Different workshops, different artisans, different villages, same grammar. That tells us a few things. First, whatever these things meant, their makers agreed on some rules. These weren't just make it pretty. They were make it like this, because that is what counts as a real Bai, a proper Cong. Second, the rules traveled. Liangzhu-style jades show up far from the core city in satellite settlements in other communities around the Lower Yangtze, even in regions that weren't fully part of the Liangzhu political heartland. Sometimes it's the same stone, likely imported. Sometimes it's local material carved into Liangzhu forms, or awkward copies where the shape is right, but the carving is hesitant. That spread looks a lot like shared beliefs moving along with goods. Imagine a small community days away from Liangzhu River. The local leader wants to signal connection to whatever powerful ritual system is centered in that wetland city. Maybe they visited. Maybe emissaries have come through. They commission their own Bai and Cong. The proportions might slip. The mask motifs might be simplified, but the intent is clear. We participate in that world. We speak that symbolic language. In a society with no surviving writing, symbolism is not decoration. It is communication. If you can't wear your rank as characters on a bronze inscription, you wear it as objects whose forms everyone recognizes. A wide, flawless Bai says this person had access to master artisans and high-quality stone, and, more importantly, the right to deploy cosmologically charged items. Cong, especially those dense with face motifs, may have worked like portable pillars, linking the living community to a layered invisible order. Ancestors, spirits, the pattern structure of sky and earth. Stack them by a body. Arrange them in rows, and you're building a miniature cosmic architecture out of jade. This is where cosmology and politics blur. If people believe that the world has an underlying order, that the sky and earth are complementary, that powerful beings inhabit the boundaries between domains, that cycles of rain and fertility and death depend on keeping those relationships in balance, then someone who can manage those relationships has immense leverage. Control over Bai and Cong is one way to materialize that claim. Not everyone can sacrifice a perfect disk to the heavens or bury a stack of Cong to anchor a lineage dead. Not everyone can commission pieces dense with the right faces. Excavations show a steep gradient. A few tombs are wash in jade, many with modest sets, vast numbers with none at all. The symbolism becomes self-reinforcing. The more jade you control, the more ceremonies you can host. The more ceremonies you host, the more you look like the person who keeps the world running properly. Rice growing, floods timed, ancestors appeased. The more people believe that, the more willing they are to send you grain, labor, and loyalty, allowing you to commission even more jade. And because the beliefs are encoded in standardized, repeatable forms, they can extend far beyond any single village. A community that shares the same basic reading of circles and squares, masks and animals, can recognize authority at a glance, even if they don't share daily life. That's the core reason Bai and Cong matter so much for understanding Liangzhu. They are not just luxury objects. They're evidence that this was a culture thinking in large abstract terms about the structure of the world, about invisible forces, about how human authority plugs into those forces. When you see a tomb where the dead are literally framed by circles and squares, by stacked tubes and encircling discs, you're looking at more than wealth. You're seeing a claim carved in stone. This person, this lineage, this community, sits at a meaningful node in the cosmos. Without texts, we can't translate the full sentence. But the grammar is there in the consistency, in the motifs, in where the jade appears and where it doesn't. To see how that grammar ties directly into power, who got to wield it, who lay beneath it, we have to follow the jade into the graves themselves. If you lay out all the Liangzhu burials on a table on paper, at least you don't see a flat community. You see a cliff at one end are graves that are little more than shallow pits. A body, maybe a few pottery vessels, sometimes a stone tool or two. Jade, if it appears at all, is a single small piece, a bead, a thin ring, a modest undecorated pendant. Then all the way at the other end, you hit tombs like a wall, large rectangular pits cut carefully into the ground, wood-lined chambers, multiple compartments, coffins surrounded by arranged offerings, and jade. Not a piece here or there, but caches, piles, dozens of Bai and Cong stacked like plates, nested, propped at the head, boxed by the feet. In a few cases, over 300 jade objects buried with a single individual. This isn't a gentle curve from poor to rich. It's a staircase with big missing middle steps. Archaeologists sometimes talk about wealth differentiation, like they'd reading off a spreadsheet. But when you translate that back into human lives, it means this. Some people in Liangzhu died wrapped in a world of stone that other people would never touch. Not once in their entire existence. Take Yaoan, one of the key Liangzhu cemeteries. At the top of its burial mound lies a single tomb, often identified as M12. It's not gigantic by Egyptian or Mayan standards, but in Neolithic China, it's a statement. The coffin area is lined, the layout is deliberate. The person inside, probably male, based on the bones we have, though preservation is spotty, is accompanied by a flood of jade, by Cong, bracelets, pendants, ceremonial axes. Below that top tomb, on lower terraces of the same mound, there are other burials. They have jade too, sometimes quite a lot, but never as much, never as fine. Go further out to smaller cemeteries around the city and the jade thins. Go out again into some rural villages contemporaneous with Liangzhu, and you hit communities, where most graves have none at all. One mound, one apex grave, then descending tiers of access to the same symbolic kit. It starts to look less like random variation and more like a social diagram built into the landscape. What does it take to put 300 pieces of finely worked jade into the ground and walk away? Start with the raw material. High-quality nephrite doesn't come from the wetlands around Liangzhu. It comes from distant mountains, probably hundreds, maybe more than 1,000 kilometers away. Someone had to organize expeditions or long-distance trade, or both, to keep that material flowing. Then factor in the labor. These are not quick carvings. Shaping, drilling, smoothing, and polishing hard jade with Neolithic tools takes an absurd amount of time. We're talking hundreds, sometimes thousands of hours per large piece. Multiply that by the contents of a rich tomb, and you're looking at entire lifetimes of specialized work embodied in one burial. If a single grave can swallow that much jade, that much labor, and still have the living shrug and say, yes, that is appropriate, it tells us something brutal and simple. The people at the top of Liangzhu society had a level of control over resources and over other people's time that most of their contemporaries did not. You don't accidentally end up with that kind of concentration. There are a few broad ways archaeologists imagine it might have worked. One possibility is a classic chiefdom, a paramount leader, maybe a small cluster of elite families sitting at the center of a web of obligations. They coordinate irrigation, defend the settlement, host the big rituals. In return, villages send them grain, labor, maybe young people for service. The elite then recycle some of this surplus back out in feasts and gifts, cementing loyalty. The jades and the big tombs could be the frozen residue of that system, each by not just a pretty object, but a token of past alliances, tributes from subordinate lineages, spoils from successful negotiations, the material proof of favors owed and returned. Another model emphasizes religious specialists. Think of a priestly stratum rather than a single secular king. In this view, what sets the top tombs apart is not just wealth, but ritual authority. The people buried there might have been the ones who performed the central ceremonies that kept heaven and earth in balance, who interpreted omens, who managed the calendar, who decided when to flood the fields and when to hold them back. If Jade and Cong are the key tools of that cosmology, then restricting their production and use becomes a way of monopolizing contact with the powers that matter. Control the objects, control the rituals, control the rituals, control the story everyone tells about why the world is the way it is, and who is allowed to tinker with it. Or you can imagine a coalition scenario. Instead of a single dominating house, there are several influential lineages, each anchoring part of the city, each with its own mound, its own set of jade-rich tombs. They cooperate when facing outside threats, compete quietly in grandeur and generosity, marry into each other's families to manage tension. In that case, the densest jade burials might mark moments when one lineage briefly gained the upper hand, or times when rival leaders tried to outdo each other in death as much as in life. Those are models, not certainties. The bones themselves don't come with job titles, but however you slice it, the inequality was real, and it had to be maintained. Belief is one way. If most people genuinely think that the cosmos only runs properly when a particular lineage uses a particular set of jades in the right sequence at the right times, then handing over grain and labor to those people feels less like exploitation and more like insurance. You're not just feeding a chief, you're feeding the person who makes sure the rice comes up and the river stays in its banks. Redistribution is another big feasts, public rituals, seasonal gatherings, moments when elites take in surplus from many households and then send part of it back out in food, drink, and small prestige items. Archaeologists see hints of this in large communal structures and in feasting debris near elite areas. If you go home from the festival full, wearing a new ornament, with a sense that your village was recognized and honored, you're more likely to accept the overall deal, even if the jade never stays with you. Marriage and alliance tie it all together. Elites can intermarry across communities, linking far-flung villages into a network where everyone has a cousin at court. Gifts of jade, small pieces this time, circulate as bride wealth, as token sealing agreements. Each transfer strengthens a chain that ultimately leads back to the core city and its mound, topped dead. And behind all of this, there is always the quiet possibility of force. We rarely find clear-cut weapons in Liangzhu tombs, set aside, as this is a sword, the way we do in later periods. But polished stone axes and blades are common, and not all of them are purely symbolic. Walls and palisades around some settlements, signs of burning in certain layers, hints of trauma on some skeletons. All of that whispers that the social order wasn't maintained solely by consensus and good stories. If someone refused tribute, if a village tried to hoard jade or ignore central rituals, there were probably consequences. What's just as telling, though, is what we don't see. For every person buried under a mound with armfuls of jade, there were hundreds who ended up in small, unremarkable graves, or in places that haven't survived at all. Their bodies lay with a couple of pots, maybe a shell ornament, maybe nothing but the earth. We don't know their names. We don't know what jokes they told while transplanting rice seedlings, what songs they used to time the hauling of soil for the dikes, what they thought as they watched processions of jade-laden elites pass by on raised causeways. We also don't see the full machinery that turned their work into someone else's tomb goods. Workshops exist, clusters of unfinished jades, piles of polishing waste, but they're often close to elite zones. Does that mean artisans lived under direct elite control, housed and fed by the palace? Or did village specialists travel in for certain seasons, bringing partially worked pieces to central finishing hubs? The archaeology can suggest patterns, but it can't overhear the negotiations. Even the spectacular tombs are incomplete stories. Grave goods tell us about how the living wanted to remember the dead or wanted them to appear. They don't automatically tell us what those people were like in life. A man buried with dozens of Cong might have been a powerful ritual officiant, or a figurehead, whose death was used as an occasion for political theater. A woman interred with a set of fine bai might have wielded real authority, or might have been the symbolic anchor of a lineage whose decisions were made elsewhere. We also have to factor in erosion, looting, simple bad luck. Some cemeteries have been plowed, others flooded, others scraped away by modern construction. For every carefully recorded elite burial, there may have been others entirely erased. For every humble grave we excavate, there might be a cluster missing that would have rounded out our picture of the middle we barely see. So when we say Liangzhu was stratified, we're collapsing a messy lived reality into a blunt term. What we can say with some confidence is that in this city of wetlands and walls, a small fraction of people had access to stunning quantities of jade and to the rituals that gave that jade meaning. Their deaths mobilized enormous labor and resources. Their tombs sit on higher ground, literally above other burials, sometimes above entire neighborhoods. The rest of the population built the dikes, tended the patties, carried the stones, carved and polished and hauled. Their fingerprints are all over the jades, but their own graves are almost bare. To see how those unequal relationships extended beyond the city to villages upriver, to communities on distant shores, to people who never saw Liangzhu, but still buried their dead with its signature shapes. We have to step outside the tombs and follow the jade along the waterways. Follow the jade and the map changes. On a modern political map, Liangzhu sits in the Lower Yangtze region, snug against the coast of eastern China. On a Liangzhu map, if they'd ever drawn one, it would look more like a spiderweb of rivers, lakes, tidal inlets, and low passes threading inland between mountain blocks. Because jade doesn't float, the most likely sources for Liangzhu's fine, greenish-white nephrite are far from the rice fields and canals of the Taihu Basin. Candidates include river-worn boulders and mountain deposits to the west and northwest, way up, in what's now an ore, further along the Yangtze corridors. There are long debates about exact quarry sites, but one thing is clear: that stone had a journey. Imagine a piece of raw jade as a kind of archaeological GPS tag. We find Liangzhu-style B and Cong, all close cousins, not just in the core city, but scattered across a broad swath of eastern China, in smaller settlements along the Lower Yangtze, in coastal sites. Edging what is now Shanghai, in inland communities, up tributary rivers, even in regions dominated by other cultures, you sometimes get a stray-by disc or tube-shaped Cong that looks done, suspiciously Liangzhu, in its proportions and polish. Those out-of-place pieces are like echoes, proof that Liangzhu wasn't a solitary wetland experiment. It was plugged into a wider Neolithic world. Archaeologists talk about the Liangzhu cultural sphere, partly because of these spreads. Within that sphere, you see recurring patterns, similar house forms, comparable pottery shapes, shared motifs on ritual objects. Outside it, contemporary communities like those of the Doenko or Quigiling traditions have their own distinct styles, but even they sometimes show hints of borrowing. A pot with a lip, more common in the Lower Yangtze, turns up hundreds of kilometers away. A burial includes a single Cong, but the rest of the grave goods match a different local toolkit. A jade pendant, drilled and polished with lean-level finesse, shows up in a region where jade working is otherwise much crudder. None of this proves a unified state or a top-down empire, but it strongly hints at regional connections, people traveling, visiting, marrying, trading, copying. The jade itself helps narrow down how those connections might have worked. Nephrite isn't evenly distributed. The particular chemical fingerprints of some Liangzhu jades suggest relatively consistent sources. That consistency over generations implies some degree of controlled access. Either Liangzhu elites sent their own people upriver to gather stone from favored spots, or they maintained stable relationships with inland communities who did the extraction. In either case, the path from mountain boulder to polished Cong in an elite tomb had multiple stops. Raw blocks might be roughed out near the source, then shipped downriver as performs. Some villages could have specialized in early-stage cutting and drilling. Bigger centers might have run finishing workshops that turned generic blanks into objects with the precise dimensions and motifs. Recognizable as Liangzhu style, every step of that chain is an opportunity for contact. Boat crews moving up and down the rivers aren't just hauling rock, they're carrying stories, gossip, new weaving techniques, new songs. A potter in a small upriver hamlet sees a slick black jar from Liangzhu and tries to imitate its shape. A jade worker in the core city receives a rough blank made by someone whose language he doesn't speak, but whose work he can read from the tool marks. When you line up Liangzhu against its neighbors, the picture sharpens. The Denko culture in Shandong to the north was also experimenting with jade, elaborate burials, and social hierarchy. Their forms are different, more emphasis on earrings, different drilling techniques, but there are overlaps in how jade clusters in the graves of a few individuals in the Qijing and Xijia areas to the west. You get impressive earthworks, sophisticated pottery, and their own ritual objects. Along parts of the southeast coast, Neolithic fisher farmer groups are playing with shell ornament and simple jade. Liangzhu doesn't look like a copy of any of these, but it doesn't look oblivious to them either. Shared themes like burying elites with hard-to-make shinies that encode cosmology pop up again and again, tweaked to local taste. That suggests ideas were flowing as much as goods. How do you move ideas in a world without writing, wheels or horses? Marriage is one of the most powerful mechanisms we know of. Even in small-scale societies today, marriages routinely cross community lines. A woman moves to her husband's village, or a man moves to his wife's. With them come personal ornaments, bits of ritual knowledge, preferred recipes, ways of speaking. If a Liangzhu lineage wanted to cement an alliance with another powerful family upriver, or with a coastal group that controlled a crucial fishing ground, sending a bride or groom with a few jade pieces as part of the bride wealth or dowry would have been a logical move. Those jades then become foreign markers in a local graveyard generations later. Silent evidence that someone's grandmother once came from downriver or over the mountains. Ritual gatherings are another likely vector. Agricultural cycles create built-in downtime and shared concerns. The flood season, the harvest, the turning of the year, perfect excuses to convene large groups. Liangzhu's monumental platforms and broad open spaces look tailor-made for periodic festivals. It's easy to imagine boats converging on the city from scattered villages and satellite settlements, people arriving with baskets of grain, bundles of reeds, maybe a few prized shells or feathers not available locally. At those gatherings, rituals centered on Bai and Cong could have been performed in full public view. Visiting leaders watch, learn, maybe receive a small jade as a token of participation. They return home and adapt what they've seen to their own traditions. Over time, This process can produce a patchwork of regional rites. Similar structures, different local flavors. The shared Liangzhu look of certain objects might reflect a kind of ritual franchise system, where central elites maintain prestige by being recognized as the keepers of the right style. Contact of this sort tends to bring prosperity. If you're plugged into a network, you have more options when the harvest is bad. You can call in favors, trade surplus in one commodity for a shortage in another, get access to exotic materials that bolster your status. A village allied to Liangzhu might gain access to better tools or find its own products. Salt, timber, fish, stone, suddenly in demand. Local leaders who can position themselves as gatekeepers to Liangzhu connections gain leverage at home. But there's a flip side. Networks also spread risk and tension. If Jade is the key to ritual legitimacy, and only certain groups can get the real stuff from Liangzhu-linked supply chains, then communities left on the margins might feel pressure to break in or to challenge the system with their own sacred stones. Competition over trade routes can create friction. A settlement controlling a narrow river bend or a low pass between watersheds can tax traffic, block access, or play rival centers off each other. Archaeological hints of palisades, burnt layers, and shifts in settlement patterns across the broader region suggest that cooperation and conflict were probably closely intertwined. Even within the Liangzhu sphere, alignments could have shifted when one lineage's marriage ties overlapped awkwardly with another's, or when a remote resource community began to realize just how valuable its stone, salt, or timber had become. So, when we talk about Liangzhu influencing its neighbors, we're not talking about peaceful diffusion on one side and cartoon conquest on the other. We're talking about a dense mesh of kin ties, ritual obligations, gift exchanges, rivalries, and negotiations stretching across river basins and coastal lagoons. A world where a jade buy from a wetland city might end up as the most treasured object in a mountain hamlet's shrine, even as that hamlet quietly wonders why it should keep honoring distant people it has never seen. Those tensions inside the network, the same connections that carried Jade and ideas, also meant that when something went wrong, it rarely stayed local. To understand how a civilization this plugged in could still vanish so completely that later, dynasties barely remembered it, we have to zoom back in on the mud, the layers, and what they say about the end. The first strange thing about Liangzhu is the name itself. It isn't theirs. Liangzhu is the name of a modern village near the first major site that defined this culture, a type site in archaeological jargon. When excavations there in the mid-9th century turned up a distinctive package of jades, pottery, house foundations, and earthworks, scholars needed a label, so they reached for the nearby place name. The same way Maya comes from a later colonial town, or Harappan, from one excavated mound in the Indus. Somewhere between 5,000 and 4,000 years ago, the people who dug those canals and carved those jade, Cong almost certainly called themselves something. They had words for their town, their river, their ancestors, their enemies. We just don't know any of them. Unlike later dynasties, Liangzhu hasn't left us a clear written voice. No clay tablets covered in signs, no bamboo slips in waterlogged pits, no carved stone monuments announcing the deeds of kings. There are a few marks that tempt us. Some jade Cong and pottery vessels bear incised symbols, short sequences of lines and shapes, often repeated, that looked tantalizingly like proto-writing. A few scholars have argued that these might be clan marks, ownership signs, or even the embryonic form of characters that later evolve into Chinese script. But they're brief. They don't run in long sequences. They don't obviously record sentences. Most researchers stop short of calling this writing in the full sense. It's more like a shared graphic vocabulary, meaningful for people in the know, but opaque to us and not clearly phonetic or grammatical. It's also possible that more explicit writing did exist, but on materials that rarely survive. If you scratch symbols into bamboo, paint them on wood, or ink them onto woven cloth, you've created records with a shelf life measured in years, not millennia, especially in a warm, wet delta that routinely floods. Even baked clay tablets can erode in unstable soils. So, we're stuck with a sample that's both tiny and heavily biased towards stone and fired earth. That silence has consequences. Without long texts, we don't know what Liangzhu people called their rulers, how they organized their lineages, what stories they told about the floods they clearly feared and engineered against. We can't hear their arguments, their prayers, their jokes. And because later written traditions only really get going in this region, 1,000 years or more after Liangzhu's apparent end, there's no obvious historical memory to plug into either. When you open early Chinese texts, the oracle bone inscriptions of the late Shang, the transmitted classics compiled in the Zhou and later periods, you do find lists of ancient peoples and shadowy polities, tribes along the eastern seas, states in the Lower Yangtze, names like Ua and Wu, and others even more obscure. It's tempting to point to those and say, aha, this must be Liangzhu, remembered under another label. But the timelines don't quite line up. By the time those texts were written, whole cycles of cultural change had rolled through the Lower Yangtze. New ceramics, new burial customs, new settlement patterns. Liangzhu's great platforms were already old ruins, if they were visible at all. Historical traditions are also messy. They fold different groups together, downgrade enemies to barbarians, elevate allies into noble ancestors. Names shift, expand, and contract. You, for example, can mean specific coastal groups in one context and a kind of catch-all, those people down there in another. So if any distant echo of Liangzhu survived in oral traditions that eventually filtered into later texts, it's been thoroughly blurred, spliced, and renamed. It's like trying to reconstruct a vanished language from a couple of lone words hiding in modern slang. Without texts, identity has to be reconstructed from other things. From the way houses are laid out in neat rows along raised causeways, from the consistent forms of pottery, thin, dark burnished jars with certain rims that show up again and again in the same river basins, from the shapes and finishing techniques of Jade, and Cong that follow strict proportions as, if guided by rules everyone understood, but nobody wrote down for us. You can think of these as a kind of material accent. Liangzhu sounds like something in the archaeological record even if we can't hear the actual words. The combination of wetland engineering, rice agriculture, and jade-saturated ritual practice forms a recognizable package, a cultural fingerprint. Ritual gives us more clues. The clustering of jade in certain graves, the pairing of Bei and Cong, the way altars and platforms sit in relation to water control features. These patterns hint at shared cosmology. Maybe different villages along the canals argued about who descended from which ancestor, or which lineage owned which stretch of patty, but when it came to burying their big men and women, with specific jade sets and orienting the tombs just so, they were clearly drawing from the same rulebook. Infrastructure is another axis of identity. To maintain dikes, levees, and canal gates year after year, different communities have to coordinate. Someone decides who brings how many people for repair work, who gets first access to the drained fields, who has the authority to close a gate in flood season, even if it drowns one hamlet to save another. The fact that we see large integrated waterworks across the lean core suggests more than a loose cluster of unrelated villages. It suggests some form of regional framework, whether we want to call it a chiefdom, an early state, or something in between, held together by shared investment in that engineered landscape. So even without a name, we can point to a pattern of life, a set of choices repeated over generations. That's identity too. Then comes the hardest part, ending the story. When archaeologists peel back the layers at Liangzhu sites, they see something that doesn't quite fit our usual narratives. In some core areas, the shift is abrupt. Above levels packed with fine jades, polished black pottery, and evidence of intensive rice cultivation, you suddenly get flood deposits, thick slabs of sterile clay, silt, and sand dumped by high-energy water. On top of that, simpler occupations or sometimes nothing at all for a long stretch. In other places across the wider sphere, the picture looks more gradual. Jade becomes rarer, pottery styles change, settlement patterns shift towards slightly higher ground, or different parts of the basin. Some practices that feel lean, certain house forms, certain farming habits seem to bleed into later cultures, altered but not entirely gone. That tension has sparked one of the big debates in Neolithic East Asian archaeology. Was Liangzhu wiped out quickly by catastrophic flooding and climatic shifts, its core population displaced or destroyed, while fragments of its culture drifted on elsewhere? Or are we mainly seeing the slow transformation of a system under pressure, water management failures, social upheavals, trade realignments, where elites lose their grip, ritual loses its jade, and new configurations emerge without a single dramatic fall? The truth may lie somewhere in between, a landscape, already stressed by social and environmental strains, then hit by a series of extreme floods that made the old wetland city model untenable. What we can say with some confidence is this: whatever they called themselves, the people who built Liangzhu's jade-laced, water-bound world did not get to leave a clear signature in the historical record. Their name vanished, their voice went quiet, and later, civilizations rose over a landscape their canals had already reshaped. To figure out how that silence happened, how an organized, worked, technically skilled society can disappear so thoroughly, we have to go back to the layers of mud, the chemistry of ancient rains, and the fragile bargains any wetland civilization makes with water. If you want to know how a story ends when no one bothered to write the last chapter, you read the binding. For Liangzhu, that binding is sediment across the core sites. There's a recurring sequence that makes archaeologists sit up. You're digging through layers that scream high organization, dense house foundations, neatly laid floors, hearths, storage pits, post holes that line up as if someone had a measuring cord. You get concentrations of rice phaliths and husk impressions, evidence of intensive processing. You get the full ritual kit by Cong plaques, finely drilled tubes, all in carefully arranged graves. Then, without any neat transitional buffer, the texture changes. Instead of trampled living surfaces, you hit thick, structurous bands of clay and silt, often with coarse sand lenses and occasional rounded pebbles. No post holes, no hearths, no pottery in primary position. Just water-laid material dumped fast and without regard for whatever was underneath it. It's like the city skipped a beat. In some areas around the big platforms and elite cemeteries, you even get multiple flood packages stacked like a grim layer cake. Occupation, flood, brief reoccupation, or use as a surface flood again. Each pulse blurs the old ground plan a little more, until the original architecture is effectively entombed under alluvium that looks on the face of it like disruption. People don't build stilted houses and elevated causeways so they can live under half a meter of simsi, sterile clay. But sediment alone doesn't tell you whether you're looking at sudden collapse, organized retreat, or a long, reluctant migration inland. So archaeologists go hunting for patterns above and around those muddy lines. One clue is what's missing. Above certain flood horizons in the core, the signature Liangzhu package thins or disappears. The black, highly polished pottery with its characteristic shapes stops showing up in quantity. The spectacular jades, especially the big, high-labor pieces, are gone. You might still find people using the area at later dates. Maybe a few scattered pits, rougher ceramics, traces of small-scale activity. But whatever's happening, it isn't a continuation of the old wetland capital in slightly muddier form. The density drops, the complexity drops, the material accent changes. When archaeologists talk about settlement density, this is what they mean. Not just how many sites show up on a map, but how thick the traces of daily life are in each place. Liangzhu's heyday layers are busy: trash pits, repair cuts, overlapping post holes from rebuilt houses. The later ones in those same low-lying zones are quiet. At the same time, you start seeing something else. More sites on slightly higher ground at the edges of the old heartland and in adjoining basins. They're smaller, their layouts are less monumental, their ritual equipment looks toned down. This is where material culture comes in as a diagnostic tool. If a society collapses in place, elites overthrown, infrastructure neglected, population drastically reduced, you often see a sharp drop in craft specialization and status display right on top of the old center. People still live there, but they stop doing the expensive coordinated things that made the place look like a capital. If people migrate voluntarily or under duress, you expect to see their habits pop up somewhere else. Same kinds of house plans, same ways of making pots, same styles of ornaments maybe, in cheaper materials at first. The signature moves just on a different stage. If what you're looking at is more like a cultural transition, new groups blending with old ideas, mutating over time, the changes tend to be more uneven. Some practices linger for generations, others vanish quickly. A kind of mosaic replaces a clear, coherent pattern. Liangzhu's end shows pieces of all three. In some core zones, the combination of abrupt flood deposits, sharp breaks in building continuity, and the absence of immediate comparable reoccupation looks like people being forced out or choosing not to come back in any organized way. That smells like partial collapse of the old system, at least locally. But in surrounding regions, especially on safer elevations, there are sites where certain Liangzhu habits seem to smolder on. The fierce Jade hierarchy, for example, fades rather than snaps. At the peak, a handful of tombs are loaded with dozens of finely carved Bai and Cong, while most graves get little or none. That's an extreme inequality in access to a very labor-intensive material. In later levels and neighboring cultural phases, you still see Blike and Con-like objects, but they tend to be fewer per grave, smaller, rudder in finish, sometimes even in other stones or imitative materials. It's as if the idea of those forms, whatever cosmological weight they carried, outlasted the ability or willingness to sink massive resources into them. You also see burial architecture changing. Deep, carefully constructed chambered tombs with multiple grave goods give way in many areas to shallower pits with simpler offerings. Orientation rules loosen. The strict pairings and quantities that archaeologists map out in classic Liangzhu cemeteries blur into more varied, less regimented arrangements. That doesn't scream everybody died at once. It sounds more like elites losing their grip, ritual being renegotiated, and old symbols being repurposed or cut down to fit new economic realities. Meanwhile, pottery tells its own quieter story. Decorative motifs shift. Vessel shapes that were once standard become rare. New forms appear that link more closely to later Neolithic and early Bronze Age cultures, further up the Yangtze and along the coast. Paste recipes and firing techniques evolve. To a ceramic specialist, those changes are like dialect drift. You can almost hear the accent sliding towards something else. But here's the crucial complication. None of this is globally synchronized. One site might show a brutal flood package, dated to roughly 4,300 years ago, with a stark drop in occupation afterward. Another, even within the broader Linghsphere, might continue with fairly linguic material, for a few centuries beyond that, just in smaller, more dispersed communities. Yet another might show early adoption of new pottery styles and burial customs, while still using elements of the old Jade repertoire. That asynchrony matters. It suggests we're not dealing with a single day of doom, a one-and-one deluge that erased an entire civilization in a single season. Instead, the archaeological record points to a staggered unwinding. Some places get hammered early and hard. Others adapt for a while. Some may experience multiple rounds of stress, flood, recovery, reorganization, before finally tipping into a new configuration. So when researchers try to label what happened to Liangzhu, they need more than a dramatic phrase. They're weighing several overlapping processes: environmental shock, especially flooding, and hydrological shifts that could undermine the wetland city model. Economic and political strain, breakdown of centralized coordination, loss of labor for maintaining big waterworks, changing trade routes that could starve elites of prestige goods, demographic change, people dying, moving away, or being absorbed into other communities, changing the population's size and composition, cultural transformation, rituals, symbols, and technologies morphing into new forms that no longer look Lingjia in the strict sense. Even if they carry some of its DNA, The layers in the ground don't pick one option for us. They just show us where something changed, and how fast. It's up to us to test different explanations against that physical record. In the next parts of the story, we'll start taking those broad categories: water and climate, conflict and politics, migration and memory, and see how well each one fits the traces in the mud. Because somewhere in that mix is the reason a people who could tame a delta and carve galaxies into stone jades ended up as a nameless civilization, buried under their own engineered landscape. If you're going to build your entire civilization around water, you're also marrying the mood swings of the sky. Liangzhu sat in the middle of a monsoon machine. Every year, the East Asian summer monsoon hauled warm, wet air north from the tropics. When that air hit cooler land, it dumped rain, sometimes gently, sometimes with the energy of a stalled freight train. Over decades and centuries, that monsoon doesn't behave like a metronome. It pulses. Climate scientists looking at the broader region see signs of shifts around the right time window, periods when the monsoon seems to have intensified, bringing heavier, more concentrated rains, and other stretches when it weakened or failed, nudging landscapes toward drought. For a rice and wetland society, both ends of that swing are dangerous. Too weak, and your patty system starts to crack. Channels silt up because there simply isn't enough flow to scour them naturally. Yields drop. Farmers start fighting over which fields get priority water, and elites who promised plenty suddenly look less godlike, too strong, and the whole low-lying plain turns into a temporary inland sea. You can see hints of those extreme years locked into the sediments. In some cores, above the tidy occupation layers and engineered surfaces, there are thick, homogeneous flood deposits that don't look like the normal seasonal overbanking you'd expect in a wetland. They look like something bigger events where the entire hydrological regime crossed a threshold. The Liangzhu engineers clearly expected water to misbehave. They built levees, diversion ditches, reservoirs, and a network of raised causeways. They terraced platforms so that the most important buildings and tombs sat above ordinary flood levels. They were not naive, but there's a limit to how much control you can impose on a delta. Picture a year or a decade when the summer monsoon stalls over the lower Yangtze, dropping rainstorm after rainstorm onto hills already saturated. Tributaries spike. The main channels swell. The carefully managed lake that cushions your city fills to the brim, then keeps rising. Earthen embankments that held firm against ordinary floods start to seep, slump, and finally fail. Once that happens, control doesn't just ratchet down a notch. It can snap. A levee breach in a flat alluvial plain doesn't neatly wash through and go away. Water fans out, slows, and spreads. It drops its load of silt and sand exactly where you least want it, on your fields and in your streets. Channels clog. Patties that needed a few centimeters of standing water suddenly sit under a meter of turbid soup. Houses designed to take periodic wet feet find themselves waist-deep for weeks. You get the kind of blanketing clay and silt layers we saw in the last section. Fast, structureless accumulations that suffocate whatever human order lay underneath. That's the catastrophic end of the spectrum. But there's also the slow squeeze. Over the long term, sea level in this region has not been fixed. After the last ice age, global seas rose. Then their rate of change shifted with regional wiggles caused by tectonics and sediment loading. Rivers, including those feeding the Liangzhu lowlands, responded by meandering, evulsing, suddenly jumping to new courses and building up or eroding away their own levees. For a civilization perched right where river meets sea, those gradual shifts translate into moving goalposts. A channel that used to drain well begins to back up because the downstream base level is higher. Tidal influence creeps farther inland, changing salinity patterns. Areas once perfect for freshwater rice edge toward brackish marsh. Even without a single megaflood, that kind of background change chips away at the reliability of your rice economy. Fields that carried families for generations start failing more often. More labor has to be thrown at dredging, levee raising, and drainage just to maintain the status quo. Marginal land at the wet edges slips below the line of profitability. When archaeologists try to test these ideas, they don't just point at a mud layer and say flood because it feels right. They pull long, narrow cores out of lake beds, abandoned channels, and low basins around the old city and read them like climate diaries. Inside those tubes of sediment are tiny, time-stamped clues, grain size, for one. Coarse sands and gravels tend to show high-energy events. Big floods chewing through banks and dumping heavy material. Fine clays and silts settling slowly in calm water suggest quieter periods. X-ray and geochemical scans reveal abrupt changes in composition that can signal sudden inputs of river water versus more stable lake conditions. Pollen grains preserved like microscopic fossils tell you what was growing nearby. Layers rich in rice pollen and the pollen of human-favored plants hint at active agriculture. Shifts toward wild wetland species, or toward plants that like disturbed salty or standing water can mark times when fields went out of cultivation or conditions changed. Then there are the really tiny witnesses, datums, and other micro-ossels. These single-celled algae build shells that are highly sensitive to salinity and water depth. A flip in datum species from forms that prefer shallow fresh patties to ones that thrive in deeper, more turbid or brackish water is a strong sign that the aquatic environment changed under people's feet. When you line up dozens of these cores from different spots and date them, patterns start to emerge. Around the time Liangzhu's material record thins and those big flood packages appear, many cores show signs of unusually intense flooding and a more unstable monsoon. It's not unanimous. Local factors matter, but there's enough convergence that climate stress and hydrological chaos looks very plausible as a major player. Yet even here, environment doesn't get to be the lone villain. The same rainfall hitting a landscape with freshly maintained levees, clear channels, and a planned surplus of coordinated labor is not the same as that rainfall hitting a system already frayed by politics, overextension, or neglect. Mud layers don't record how many workers turned up for repair duty, or whether the ruling families diverted more labor to building ever fancier jade tombs instead of raising embankments. They don't record whether factional infighting delayed decisions until it was too late, or whether refugees from earlier floods upstream were already straining food supplies. Environmental pressure and human decision-men are braided together. A rising water table is a problem. A rising water table, combined with elites who can no longer command enough trust or muscle to rebuild the dikes, is a catastrophe. And this is where the story loops back out of prehistory and into us. Societies that depend on intricate infrastructure, especially water infrastructure, don't just fall because it rains too much one year. They fall when their ability to maintain, adapt, and redesign that infrastructure erodes faster than the riverbanks. By the way, if you want to go deeper into how climate swings and human choices have repeatedly tangled across world history, the full book version of this story is up at sleepytimehistory.com. And there's a discount running this week for Liangzhu. The wetland that had once been their superpower became a trap. The same low, rich, easily irrigated land that let them build a jade-studded capital also left them exquisitely vulnerable. When the monsoon shifted and the rivers shrugged, but climate and water only set the stage. Whether the actors freeze, flee, or fight is another matter. In the next part, we'll look at what happens when political structures strain under that pressure. When competition for land, labor, and ritual prestige turns the rising water from a shared problem into a weapon and an excuse. Power in a place like Liangzhu wasn't just about who sat on the tallest platform. It was about who could make thousands of people move in the same direction at the same time, year after year. And that's where inequality comes back into the frame. Those jade Cong didn't carve themselves. The terraces, dams, and causeways didn't emerge from spontaneous community spirit. They were the product of command, someone deciding where the canal would run, whose fields would be sacrificed for the reservoir, who got extra rice in a bad year, and who went hungry. At first, that kind of inequality can feel like a fair trade. You give a priest-king your labor, your surplus grain, your sun for the work crew, and in return the fields stay watered, the floods are tamed, and the ancestors remain on your side. The jade on the hill is proof the spirits are listening. But when the system starts to falter, inequality doesn't stay abstract. It becomes personal. Imagine a stretch of bad monsoons. Some levees fail, some don't. Some communities get prompt repairs, others wait. The storehouses in the core city still seem to have grain, while outlying hamlets are scraping the bottom of every basket. You don't need written records to see how that would play out. In the archaeological record, one of the telltale signs of rising tension is divergence. Rich tombs staying rich even as the average burial thins out. Elite compounds staying maintained while more modest structures are abandoned or rebuilt in cheaper, more hasty fashion. Workshops near the center still turning out high-quality jade even as outer zones show less craft specialization. At Liangzhu, we do see that kind of sharp hierarchy. Monumental platforms and finely furnished graves for a small number of people. Simpler pits and fewer grave goods for everyone else. That imbalance was baked into the system long before the end. What we don't have yet are smoking guns of armed conflict. If Liangzhu had collapsed in a blaze of warfare, we'd expect a few specific kinds of traces. Mass graves with clear trauma, skulls cracked by blows, ribs pierced by projectiles, bones cut or burned in ways that don't match ordinary ritual, defensive works hastily reinforced, ditches recaught and deepened, palisade lines rebuilt over and over, burn layers in key structures, not just accidental hearth fires, but widespread synchronized destruction. So far, those hallmarks are thin on the ground. There are occasional hints of interpersonal violence, as you'd expect in any dense society, but not the sustained pattern of warfare you see in some later Bronze Age cities. That doesn't mean conflict wasn't there, it just might have worn a different face. Think about water as a political weapon. If you control the gates on the main canal, you don't need an army to hurt your enemies. You can simply decide that repairs will unfortunately be delayed to their side of the basin. You can release water at the wrong time, sabotaging a planting season. You can prioritize the patties that send grain to your own warehouses over those that feed a rival lineage. None of that leaves the same kind of archaeological signature as a burned fort. It leaves patchy fields, frustrated farmers, and whispered curses against the people in charge of the soil. Now, layer factional politics on top. Liangzhu wasn't a simple one-house show forever. As lineages expanded and new elite families rose on the back of successful trade or control of certain rituals, you'd expect competition over who got to speak for the ancestors, who got the prime burial plots, who controlled the flow of prestige jade. In that kind of environment, every failed harvest, every flood, every ruined patty becomes ammunition. One faction blames another for diverting labor to an extravagant tomb project instead of rebuilding embankments. Someone accuses someone else of offending the spirits, pointing to the breach in the canal as proof. A junior branch of the ruling clan promises they could manage the water better if only people would shift their loyalty. On the ground, this plays out as coordination failure. The brilliance of Liangzhu's water system lay in its integration. Dams upstream buffered flows, canals, distributed water across a broad plain, fields, causeways, and settlement platforms all interacted with the same controlled hydrology. But that very integration comes with a dark side. It depends on everyone playing their assigned part. If one jurisdiction decides to hold back on maintenance because they've overt taxed or angry or trying to leverage a better deal, the costs don't stop at their border. Sediment builds up, flows root, weak points appear downriver. In a purely technical sense, the solution is obvious. Fix the weak points, increase collective labor, redig the channels. Politically, that means wresting resources from people who are already stressed and may no longer believe the center can deliver. When that trust cracks, infrastructure flips from asset to liability. A wall that everyone maintains is protection. A wall that only some people maintain starts to funnel disaster toward those left out. A canal that is dredged on schedule brings life. A canal that's silted up on one side of a factional boundary sends unexpected flood pulses to the other. From the outside, centuries later, we just see the end state. Channels abandoned, dams breached or buried, occupation layers petering out. But behind that physical decay could be a long story of political paralysis, meetings that went nowhere, rituals that failed to convince leaders who could no longer command the bodies needed to keep the water machine humming. In that context, elite replacement doesn't have to mean palace coups with knives in the dark. It could look like people voting with their feet, an up-and-coming faction in some neighboring upland or along a different branch of the river offers a simpler deal. Move here, work these fields, take part in our rituals. No giant embankments to maintain, no flooded capital to bail out. Maybe fewer jade ornaments, but more predictable yields. Over a generation or two, key specialists, craftspeople, ritual experts, managers start marrying into those other communities. Some of the ritual symbols of Liangzhu travel with them. Specific forms of Bai and Cong, patterns of burial, ways of organizing fields. At the core site, fewer hands show up for dredging duty. Fewer sons are willing to be buried on the great platform under heaps of jade that no longer guarantee anything. The ruling line looks around and realizes that the city that once anchored the entire region is hollowing out from the inside. From an archaeological perspective, this can look strangely gentle. No char destruction, no layers of smashed bone, just fewer and fewer signs of life, then none. The center goes quiet, while in surrounding areas you see continuity in tools, farming, and sometimes even ritual items, just under new roofs and new local names. That's cultural absorption. Instead of a civilization dying in place, it dissolves into the cultures around it, like ink dispersing into water. The Liangzhu way of managing rice, building platforms, carving jade, and maybe even thinking about the cosmos doesn't vanish. It gets folded into whatever comes next. The early cultures that later Chinese traditions will look back on and mythologize without knowing exactly who did what, where. To us, centuries and millennia later, that looks like disappearance. One moment, dense jade burials and big earthworks. The next, a quieter landscape, new ceramics, different settlement patterns. It's tempting to draw a thick line and say, here, the Liangzhu civilization ended. But on the ground, for the people living through it, the story was probably less about endings and more about renegotiation. New leaders, new centers, old ideas, remixed under different skies. The jade cities didn't crumble into nothing. Their power structures proved fragile. Their rituals lost their monopoly. Their capital lost its pull. Yet, their descendants and their cultural DNA kept walking, planting, carving, and praying in the same river valleys. In the final part, we'll follow those echoes forward, how traces of Liangzhu's thought world and technology show up in later traditions, and how a nameless wetland kingdom might still be haunting the foundations of what we call Chinese civilization today. If you zoom out from the drama of collapse and ask a quieter question, what actually survived, the picture gets more subtle and honestly more interesting, because even without names, without chronicles, without a single intact scroll, Liangzhu does not feel like a complete dead end. It feels like a foundation that later builders paved over brick by brick without ever knowing whose house they were standing on. Take Jade for a start. Thousands of years after Liangzhu's dams silted up, later dynasties are still obsessing over jade. Philosophers write that the gentleman compares his virtue to jade. Ritual manuals lay out which kinds of jade discs belong in which ceremonies. Jade Bai become tokens of heaven, Jade Cong fade into obscurity. But the idea that carved stone can bridge human and cosmic order never really goes away. Is that a straight line from Liangzhu to Zhou ritual texts? No. Too much time. Too many missing layers. But when you see very similar forms, flat discs, columnar tubes with cornered exteriors, reappearing in later Neolithic and early Bronze Age cultures to the north and west, it's hard not to suspect a shared inheritance. Maybe not a conscious memory of Liangzhu as a place, but a memory embedded in practice. This is how you mark a sacred boundary. This is what a serious burial looks like. Jades reserved for the few, used to stage a relationship between the living, the dead, and the sky. Chinese tradition later turns jade into a moral technology, something that disciplines the self, represents purity, stands between the ruler and the chaos outside. Liangzhu's jade was doing something similar long before anyone wrote those ideas down. Whether that's direct descent or convergent thinking on the same material, it's one of the clearest ways the wetland kingdom still whispers in later ritual. But then the mystery pushes back between the last flourishing Liangzhu platforms and the earliest clearly documented dynastic states. There are gaps, regional cultures that rise and fall, shifts in pottery styles, changes in settlement patterns. Archaeologists give them modern names: Kia, Lan, Shiji. None of them come with a label saying former Liangzhu people now relocated. We don't know what the Liangzhu called themselves. We don't know what their neighbors called them. We don't know which later legendary groups, if any, might preserve a warped folk memory of jade cities in the southern wetlands. That silence is part physical, part historical. Wetland sites rot. Wooden tablets, fiber, bark, all the cheap everyday materials you would have used to keep accounts or scratch short notes disappear in mud and bacteria. Whatever oral traditions survived the dispersal of Liangzhu's people were filtered, edited, overwritten by centering states that emerged hundreds or thousands of years later. So scholars argue some see deep continuity: rice agriculture, water management, and jade ritual, radiating north over centuries, slowly crystallizing into the ritual systems you eventually see codified in Zhou and early imperial texts. Others are more cautious, pointing to abrupt changes, regional breaks, and the sheer weight of time between 2500 B.C. and the first solid historical inscriptions. And into that fog step the new tools. Remote sensing is beginning to pick out faint traces of canals, levees, and platforms under modern fields. Hints that Liangzhu wasn't just a single city, but part of a more expansive engineered landscape than we realized. As those patterns emerge, we can start asking whether later sites reused the same alignments, the same hydrological logic. Refined dating, high-precision radiocarbon Bayesian modeling is tightening the timelines. Instead of broad, sometime in these 3 centuries, we're starting to see which regions lit up just as Liangzhu dimmed, which communities may have overlapped for a human lifetime or two. Residue studies on pottery and tools are telling us more about what people actually did, day to day, what they cooked, fermented, stored, whether certain vessel shapes stayed tied to rice, or is shifted to other grains in successor cultures. That helps trace not just people on the move, but habits on the move. And in a few lucky cases, ancient DNA is coming into play. Rice genomes can show lines of descent, which strains were domesticated, where and how they spread. Human remains, when the preservation cooperates and ethical frame works, can sometimes reveal population continuity or replacement. Did the people in a later site near Liangzhu share ancestry with the earlier wetland inhabitants, or were they newcomers adopting an abandoned landscape? None of this delivers a neat origin story. It just sharpens the outlines of what we can and can't say. What we know: by the time bronze-wielding states were building walled cities in the central plains and writing the earliest Chinese characters, there was already a long tradition in eastern China of managing water, growing rice at scale, and using jade as a way of staging power and cosmology. Liangzhu is one of the clearest, earliest, and most spectacular expressions of that tradition. What we suspect that ideas born in those jade cities about how to link political authority to control of water, how to fuse ancestor worship with social hierarchy, and how to materialize heaven and earth in a piece of stone, did not vanish with the last flood. They were carried, reinterpreted, and eventually folded into the very fabric of what later generations would call Chinese civilization. even if they had forgotten the specific mouths that first spoke them. What we don't yet know, the pathways, the middle stories, the names of the people who kept a few Liangzhu patterns alive in some smaller valley, while new centers rose elsewhere. The precise degree to which later Jade rites are remembering versus reinventing. That's where you come in. You've now heard some of the main theories: climate and floods, political fragmentation, cultural absorption, long echoes in ritual and Jade. Which version feels most plausible to you? Do you picture Liangzhu as a lost ancestor of later China, or as a parallel branch that quietly ended while others took over? Let me know in the comments. I really do read through your takes, and I'm curious where you land after this journey. If you enjoyed exploring this nameless Jade civilization, it's just one chapter in a much bigger story. I've put together a book of prehistoric secrets and deep-time mysteries, going far beyond Liangzhu to other forgotten worlds and near extinctions. And if you'd like to keep traveling back into these hidden layers of the past with me, please take a moment to like this video, subscribe to the channel, and share your thoughts below. Tell me which theory you favor, and also where you're listening from. I love seeing this community of time travelers mapped out across the modern world that grew from all these ancient experiments.